So the presentation this afternoon will be in English. We are going to be discussing the work of Danish-American artist Lasse Antonsen, who has made this installation in which we're sitting under right now, Carried by the Wind. The basis of it is a Cold War propaganda campaign that took place in West Germany with these exact balloons, replicas. These are replicas, in other words. So it's a wonderful project. We're so glad to have Lasse here, as well as two art historians that will discuss the concept, reflect upon his ideas, as well as present some additional historical information, both from a German perspective with native Leipziger art historian Constanze Frisch, as well as Polish art historian Karol Josiek. So, we're going to begin with Lasse, so if you can hold your questions until the end, there'll be 3 presentations and then an open discussion between the 3 historians. So, Lasse.
Thank you, Candace, and welcome. I'm happy to see you all. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm very happy also to have Karol and Constanze here. Later hear their thoughts on my work. I think to begin with, what I can talk about is that I come from Denmark. I grew up in Copenhagen, and I got involved with art fairly early on, and that's what I will talk about a little bit, and then I'll talk about my work a little bit, and then about this exhibition here. A lot of people have asked me, why did I choose to put Bruno Schultz in this exhibition here? And for me, it comes from that when I was 14 years old actually, he was translated into Danish. And I read about him in the papers, I bought the book, and it was for me really the first time where I got to think about literature in a way I hadn't thought about it before. So in a way, I became later an academic, and I can see that was sort of the beginning of me becoming an academic. And I was wildly fascinated by the language and the world that it created. And so I really treasured that book for a long time. I still have the book. So this is the cover of it, and I'll get back to that in a second. Growing up in Copenhagen, it's sort of I have to bring you a little bit into what happened in Copenhagen and in Denmark in the 1960s. I'm 67 years old now, so I was young in the early 60s, and there was a movement in Copenhagen of young artists that created an alternative to the academy. And it became a very famous undertaking because these young artists were all some artists that became very famous later on. And I was in high school, found out about it, and began to attend it. So I was sort of 16 years old. And looking back, I was really too young to be involved in it, but it was fascinating at the same time. And I'm almost certain that it is not me standing up there to the right, but that's exactly how I looked at the time. The person who is standing smoking a pipe, you had to be a real artist at the time and sort of smoke pipes and wear corduroy jeans and so on. But I was already sort of into Beatles hair and so on, so a little bit different from that. But that person standing there is this painter, Per Kirkeby. And he's the most famous painter up to quite recently in Denmark. And at that time, what was very important is that he was studying at the university, but not to be an artist, but to be a geologist. He's a scientist. And actually, the time I got to know him, he was participating in expeditions to Greenland, bringing back meteors and many other things. So that was a part of his world. And just very briefly, what would be going on in an art school like that in 1963, when I was there, 62, 63. And it is, if you're knowledgeable about and know sort of the grand overview of art history, this is a time before pop art and before minimalism and many other things that were going on. But what really was going on is, you can see in a painting like this by Per Kirkeby, who is, I don't know how many of you really know him. He has had major retrospectives at the Tate Gallery in London about 4 years ago and so on. And it's the same time frame as Sigmar Polke. And if you're interested in art, what's interesting in this here is that a new kind of way of making art came about, where you could blend many different sources together. And it actually goes back to the artist Picapia. Picapia was sort of discovered by a group of different artists, including Per Kirkeby, Sigmar Polke, Gerhard Richter, Anselm Kiefer, and all that. And that is the kind of circle of people that got involved in this. Later on, especially in the high point of Per Kirkeby's career is the 90s, where he's becoming much more lyrical and works with very large-scale paintings. This is 3 meters tall. It's a huge painting. What's important with him, too, which is the theme of what I'll talk about, is that he's also a poet and a writer. He is as acknowledged as a poet in Denmark, very little translated, but also a poet. Then there was this magical man there, was art historian, and I became an art historian myself later. He's still alive, and it's Troels Andersen. And he was the art historian at this alternative place. And when I talk about alternative place, you have to think of like Leipzig, in a backyard, in a building upstairs that has 2 rooms where there's a little bit of a printing press, nobody has money, everybody's poor, everybody is wildly excited about doing something, but there's no official support. It's just a group finding each other. And Troels Andersen, what was very important for me, was a specialist in Malevich. So here I met an art historian who had done research in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and here published, this is a publication from the 60s. He had already begun to be really famous at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And his thinking and his talks were very important for me because he introduced me to something very appropriate, I think, for the exhibition we have in here of the Russian constructivism. But he was especially interested in Malevich and had done research in the Soviet Union on Malevich. And the idea of suprematism, which is a kind of way of approaching reality that lies, in a sense, beyond reality. It's a kind of supremacy of feeling, Malevich would call it, and talk about it like that, but also simply a space where original forms and thoughts come from. So very briefly about what happened with that. And then for many years, the real main leader of this experimental art school, as they called it, was Paul Gannes. And whenever I had to explain to people that I had studied with Paul Gannes, nobody knew who he was. But this is actually an exhibition of his work, which happened, I'm just going to look at it here. Well, it's the Kunstverein Hamburg, and I think it was probably about 4 years ago. And Paul Gannes, from being a totally obscure Danish artist, but famous in Denmark, has all of a sudden become a really hot international artist. And I find it very strange all of a sudden that, and I think it's, when you're an artist, you often toil without anybody really paying attention to you, and then you die, and many years after that, somebody like Paul Gannes is becoming extremely famous. And there's Agnes Gund, for those of you who are in the American art scene will know that she is the main driving force behind the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She was interviewed about 6 months ago, and somebody asked her, what really excites you right now? And she said, Paul Gannes. I've discovered this Danish artist, Paul Gannes. But it's because it's being spread now through the commercial art world too. And then after I had been at that place, I was for a while, between 17 and 18, at an alternative art school, another one. I've been very lucky I was in these 2 in Denmark. It was one that was built on Black Mountain College. And if some of you are in Berlin, you will see that there is an exhibition right now at the Hamburger Hof on the Black Mountain School. And it's very important in the German context because it also brought in what has some of the teachers that have been at Bauhaus and they went to the United States. And they actually, because of, for many different reasons, you can read it and see it if you go to that exhibition, some of it being that they were accused of being communists and so on in a very hectic atmosphere of the States, had to close. But it opened, a similar one opened up in Denmark. It only lasted for a couple of years, and we were 30 students with only artists teaching, and I think we're about 15 to 20 artists who were all in their 20s and 30s, and we were all in our 20s and 30s, except me, who was 17. And they brought in all their friends and so on. And one of the people there, and what really became important for me, is the poet Inger Christensen. And you see her here being put on a laurel wreath in 1970. By 1970, I knew her in 1963, 64. She was giving this laurel wreath. She is the poet in Denmark that people love. You know, always artists you sort of hate and love, but Inger Christensen everybody loves. It's amazing literature. I just want to show a little bit of a kind of poem she does. It takes a little too much time to read it, but it's also about the night, it's about the sky. It's very poetic reading. She's been translated extensively into German. There's Smettelingstag, Sommerfugledagen in Danish. And here she did it shortly before she died in 2006 in Frankfurt. I encourage you to read her. It's very difficult to translate her, which I think is the same that we have with Ona Schultz. These are people that are masters of their own language. So now, what happened after all of that is I sort of got involved with these things so early on, and I didn't really know where I was going, what I was doing. These were the hippie years. I lived in Morocco for a while. I lived in Spain. I traveled around. And so I began to realize I needed to do something with my life and pull it together. I had met an American woman. I began to study art history at Copenhagen University. I went to the States. I continued on a little bit late. I was at Harvard University and I was at Tufts University. And so what happened for me was basically I became a curator, and I presented a lot of different artists' work over the years, and it was very satisfying. But in the 90s, I began to realize that I had an urge to be an artist. I just knew I needed to do something. And I did work like this, for example, which is really two different plant forms that I have joined together. So you get a kind of exotic plant. And part of the world I went into and I really loved was the natural history world. And similarly, I began to put things like capacitors and other sort of transistor parts and so on together with natural parts. So I would make these small objects. And thinking back of it now, when you're an artist, it's really amazing how much you do things that you move into new realms. But in a way, it's almost as if it's scripted for you too. It's you know, fate also drives you. And these, my earliest work I called lost words. I just don't know why, but I just knew they were lost words. I was retrieving words from somewhere. And this one here, even when I pulled it, I was so reminded of what's happening here. You have a capacitor here that stores energy, and then you have a leaf that I glued onto it, and there's a seed in it, and obviously the idea is that they should fly off, and these two kinds of energy are joined in together. Then I did a series of these. I did, I think, about 50 of them, and these I began to collect envelopes that had been opened by the Nazis. Denmark was occupied. Anything that went. So here we have things about traveling, information, censorship, and so on. And I began to collect them and frame them and put cicadas on them. And I began to realize that there was a real reason why I put cicadas on them, which is that this is a kind of insect. Have you have them in Germany? Cicadas. And no. They actually live in the ground it depends on their life cycle, but they can be in the ground for like 5, 7, 11, or 12 years. then they come up, they transform, and they fly for a very short period of time. And I think in my interest in the larger scope of things, I'm really interested in fascism. I'm interested in how the mind works. And for me, this became a kind of metaphor for fascism. I unfortunately do think that we look at history, that it's always there underneath the ground, and if the conditions are right, it unfortunately takes flight. So that was one thing. I had a need to do that. I put also on here, this is one that was sent out of Denmark, and I thought the Danes were really clever. They had this pigeon, a dove, a peace dove with a branch, that they even dare do that in like 1943 or 44. But there's another reason I did this too that I began to realize, which is of my personal history, that when Denmark was occupied in 1940, there was absolutely no work. And the German government and the Nazis were very interested in getting Danes to come down and work here. The men were all in the armies and so on, and they, from some countries, they would conscript people. Other instances, like Denmark, they were trying to invite people to come down, but there was also no work. So actually, my grandfather came and worked here with my father. And my father is the seventh one, I think, in the family, but he was the only one that was willing to go with his grandfather because he was 15 years old. And they're all passed away, and I would love to know where they were. But in a way, I'm realizing too that when you work as an artist on a more personal level, that these are the kind of letters that I never got to see, in a way. It's a view of how they were when they were shown. So I began to do this kind of work, and you could see this all very small. Now, why is that? Well, I had a career. I was extremely active. I had 2 children. I was married, a lot of obligations. The only way to make art was really to make something small. And then you could sort of think about it and work conceptually. But once I began to show it, which started in about 10 years ago, I've been very fortunate. I very quickly got opportunities to show different places. And this is an exhibition I did in Boston. I was invited to do what's called the Artist Foundation. And I transformed the whole space with white flowers. So this is the way I began to do work when I do larger installations. So it's actually plastic flowers. They're dipped in white paint, and they're all around it. But what was also important for me, you can read, this is translated from French and from Victor Segalin, a really wonderful man who was a poet, he was a doctor, he was a traveler, really important within the philosophical world, not as one of the big name philosophers, but one of those that are sort of lying underneath the surface. And I felt that this text here is actually in that white room, went all the way around so people could read that. And it says, upon a ladder of steps made of artifice and skill, would not the highest wrong be to express one's vision by an instantaneous, continuous translation that would echo one's presence? And that's actually something that I feel when we're talking about things that have to do with ideas of utopias and so on. What is it an artist does? I believe it's this. An artist really has to live in vulnerability. And that vulnerability is that you translate yourself all the time. You really have to have the ability to leave yourself. It's about you, and at the same time, it's not about you at all. And to meet the challenge of, in a sense, artifice and skill. You have to require skills, you have to have artifice, you have to create things, and at the same time you have to transcend yourself every time you do it. So I realized early on this was a kind of mantra for me. This is a work that I did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It's actually been shown quite extensively, which I'm very happy about. And I have refused to sell it. I want the museum to have it. So here you get my bloated ego, but that's what I want. I call this space of emplacement, and this little text goes with it when I show it. And I said, I had this image of 3 armadillos in my mind for a long time. So they're taxidermy armadillos. I always knew they would be rather hilarious, as if I had trained them for my own private circus. but I also felt they represented a shift in consciousness. I greatly admire a certain aspect of the French philosopher Michel Foucault's writing, especially his unfinished essay on heterotopias, which is really a kind of spaces of alternative reality. But in that essay, he also talked about Galilei and what happened when the world became round. And I love the idea of that supposedly these armadillos, I have them on balls and they're scooting around, but they can actually supposedly make themselves into a ball. If they see danger, they can roll down a hill and into maybe safety in that way. I was invited with 5 other artists about 4 years ago now, I think, to be by the Natural History Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, to what they call Mine the Collection, which is that they invite an artist in and you can find some objects and then you can present them in a way that a museum can't present them. So it was a wonderful opportunity, and I found all these bird skins. In the 19th century, scientists were sort of obsessively collecting birds. They weren't, they just took the inside out, they kept the feathers, and they put cotton inside, and has cotton eyes. So this was only meant to be in storage, but I took it out and put them up. And what I did too was that I interspersed the birds. I actually put them on the wall on shelves, but the shelves were sentences. So there was an essay that I had by Roger Caillois, who's a French writer, very important French writer for me, and it was a text that he had written. So I made it as the shelves of text, and all the birds were lying on it, and then it went out into the space, which is what you can kind of see the way it moves into space there. The text itself, he had written in, I think it was 36. And one of the things that fascinates me, again, we talk about utopias. We have utopias different places, and surrealism was one of them. And surrealism was, and is still for us, tremendously important. But for people in 1936, it was devastating to realize that if you had, as an artist, felt that surrealism would be part of something that would free you, that would bring you somewhere else, that would connect you with the subconscious, would unleash energy that hasn't been before. And while you're busy with that, the whole world is turning fascist. I mean, it's in Italy, it's in Spain, it's in Germany, and you're up against a kind of realization, and this is what he writes about, that it's both a failure and not a failure, but he's trying to grapple with where do you go now when you have believed in something. And I realized only, and that's happened often when I do artwork, is that when I put it together, I began to realize what it was, and only after the whole thing was up did I realize that the birds for me represented ideas that once flew but doesn't fly anymore. In a way, it was dead ideas, and so that was what mattered to me. So back to Brother Schultz and this exhibition here, very briefly. I have these spread around, these excerpts of different kinds. Many of them are about air and flying, and you can see them lying around. And Brother Schultz himself was Polish, Jewish, born in 1892, not that famous before World War II, but had begun to be really acknowledged. A lot of people had begun to find him and encourage him to write. He was a very complex individual, but then eventually where he was in Poland, it was occupied by the Nazis, and as a revenge act by one Nazi general to another, he was shot in broad daylight in the street in 1942. It was a great loss. And here we see him. And I like the complexity of him. I do think that artists, again, and I talked a little bit before, you enter into territory that is difficult to negotiate, and he certainly did. Here is the book in one edition from Poland. And I do think that this is a very romantic depiction, but it is still the idea that personified by this kind of inspiration, this world enters into your mind. And I do believe that really is the case. Now, a lot of people have been fascinated with Bruno Schulz before me. This is the brothers Kay. I'm not sure they are very known here, but they make films. They make films, stop-action films, so they actually work with puppets. They move them just a little bit and make a photograph of what they do. They are twins, identical twins, and if you don't know their work, I will highly recommend looking at it. The Museum of Modern Art in New York made a major exhibition about them, where people stayed in for almost days because it's a lot of video, a lot of background from who they are and their background. But the really very famous one is built on this exact text as I have here. But I think we all build on Bruno Schulz in the way that we get inspired and take off of it. That's really how he functions. The very important American writer Cynthia Ozick wrote The Messiah of Stockholm. We know that Bruno Schulz was working on a very large novel when he died that was called The Messiah. And everybody, of course, this is one of these, we're sure, lost masterpieces. So Cynthia Ozick actually writes about a person who believes that he is Bruno Schulz's son, and then arrives a woman who says that is Bruno Schulz's daughter and that she has the manuscript. And I found to my surprise, I have to look at my notes here, that there was just a couple of years ago a performance of the Singläden in, let's see where I wrote it down, in Gerhard Hauptmann Theater in Görlitz, so very close to the Polish border. Don't know much about what they did, but this is an online photograph from their performance. So here are the balloons as they were taken out and released during the Cold War period. And this is really the photograph that inspired me to do this installation you see here. Very briefly, started, actually the year I was born, 1947 to 48, with the Marshall Plan. They began to realize that they could begin to send this kind of material up because Radio Free Europe was being blocked. Operation Prospero is one that is a very important one. Each one of them had their own name, as depending on where they came from or went into, with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. It seemed to be there was Romania and Bulgaria, but I don't know that they went that far. It was maybe wishful thinking. A person was just here a little earlier and mentioned that he saw the balloons coming right over Leipzig. So they had to go, in certain instances, right over here. And this is a kind of thing that sometimes would be in there. There would be a lot of different information. There would be propaganda of different kind. There would be defectors from the communist regime. And something like this: a new wind is blowing, new hope is stirring, friends of freedom in other lands have found a new way to reach you. So that is the kind of message, a message of hope, a message of that we haven't forgotten you. And we have to think about, after World War II, how the countries were not communist right away. It was usually masterminded that the communist regime slowly took power with the help of the Soviet forces. So people were forced into this. And another photograph that shows the release, and a photograph I took here the other day. It was actually before the Boxers had released the writing. And a couple of things, just what it means for me to have made this installation. Religions and countries often have symbolism of ascension or descension. You have Muhammad, for example. That's why Jerusalem is always going to be a huge problem, because on the mound that is actually where the Temple Mount is where Muhammad ascended. And there is even marks in the stone, and you can see where he ascended. And in America, where I live now, there is, in Plymouth, there is a rock where the first people ever stepped down. All of this is, of course, fiction. It's mythologizing your background and so on. But this kind of idea of an ascension or descension, I feel, is in my work here, too. I did make it in a way that that it is massive. There's a lot of it, but I just wanted to point out that it's not related, even though some of this material has to do with the Holocaust. This is a monument I think most of you know from Berlin. These kinds of Holocaust memorials are really graves in many ways. They are empty. They are absence. And for me, I'm trying to do just the opposite. We have this that you know here in Leipzig, where the synagogue used to be. But for me, making this here exhibition was a reversal of that in many ways. It's about hope. It's about finding a way to move into something new. Thank you.